thanks to everyone for who's invited us to be here today, and thanks for joining this workshop. So this presentation is about what we'd like to share with you is our journey, the journey we've been on in Lancashire in relation to multi-agency working, which has very much been supported by the N8 Policing Research Partnership. So I'm Lindsay Youansamouth. I'm a qualified social worker with a practice background in mental health and child protection. So I came out of frontline practice to actually study for an N8 doctoral studentship, a collaborative project between Lancashire Constabulary and Lancaster University back in 2016. And today we're going to explore some of the work that's developed beyond that PhD studentship into the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network that is today. So I'll hand over to my colleague Steve now to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chief Inspector Steve Anderton. I'm the Operational Policing Lead within the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. Got a background in uniform policing duties. I'm a knife crime lead for Lancashire. A previous experience working with neighbour policing and partnership roles across the force, and now we're working together as part of the partnership. And I'll hand over to my colleague Siobhan.
My name's Siobhan Collingwood, and I'm head teacher at Morecambe Bay Community Primary School. 2 days a week and then 3 days a week I work with the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network as education lead. I've had a lot of background in the whole field of wellbeing and mental health and safeguarding, as well as curriculum design at a national level. So that's what brought me to working with the LSCB.
Brilliant. Thanks for Siobhan. Next slide, please. So very much in line with the N8 Policing Research Partnership, our focus is on establishing and formalising regional networks to share learning. It's about knowledge exchange, developing research and innovation in practice as well. But we've moved on now. So beyond the N8 Policing Research Partnership, we're very much focused on a multi-agency networked approach in Lancashire. And that was very much led by the N8 initially, and going on a wider basis to Siobhan's example from education, but also children's social care, public health, third sector and private sector organisations as well. So as an introduction to the structure of our presentation today, it's divided into 6 sections. I won't go into depth in each, but we'll start with a bit of background, and we'd like to take you through our journey of developing a multi-agency approach through the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network work. Thanks. Next slide, please. So in terms of a brief background, so as I said, a lot of this work began from the N8 Policing Research Partnership in Lancashire. So I myself undertook a doctoral research project in collaboration with Lancashire Constabulary, which began in 2016. And the topic initially focused on police and social workers working together and how that's done, exploring the challenges and successes and facilitators and barriers to joint working between the police and social services. However, it evolved quite rapidly into focusing more on multi-agency working, so taking into account that the police come into contact with lots of different agencies on a day-to-day basis. And the focus was also particularly on early action and preventative policing and public sector working more broadly. The key findings from this project have been heavily embedded in the strategic development of the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network, which I'll hand over now to the next slide.
Okay, so I'll come in here and just explain for those on the call that weren't aware that as part of £100 million in funding serious violence that the government announced in April 2019, the government identified 35 million specifically for 18 forces to set up and fund violence reduction units across the country. So we're just waiting for funding confirmation now from the spending review to announce further future agreements. However, obviously understanding in this current climate that funds are extremely tight. But certainly last year from April, Lancashire received 1.82 million surge funding, and that was predominantly to look at increased activity, more stop searches, and certainly target individuals locations and hotspot areas to obviously target knife crime. We also received 1.1 million to introduce the violence reduction unit in Lancashire, and that's what we did last year. We've got a core group of 24 to 25 people from a variety of agencies, and we've been working together. We called ourselves Violence Reduction Unit last year. However, we've moved to call ourselves the Violence Reduction Network this year because what we've found is that's more appropriate to what we actually do. We network with partners and we work together. I'll hand over to Siobhan to talk through the new legal duty.
So I think the thing that makes the work of the Violence Reduction Networks across the country pretty unique and perhaps different to what the public actually expects from it is this public health approach that's cited upstream, looking at the causes of the causes and working together, joining multi-agency practice. And within this, there's a legal duty on public bodies to prevent and tackle serious violence. So the key being there, prevent and tackle. And that then if we come on to the third bullet point, the other key that we've got there is really looking at ways to work together across all of our agencies, so that we're really looking for new ways of breaking down those barriers to communicate effectively with each other. So, moving on to this next slide. So on here, I just want to talk you through what were the key strands really, the golden threads that run through everything that we do within the Violence Reduction Network. First of all, is that network of multi-agencies. So I think where we've really taken the bit between our teeth is to bring all those agencies together. So within our network, we've got children's social care, police representatives, probation service, drug offending teams, MARAC, social work, and then myself in education. And now, when we first got together, we were quite distinct within our agencies. But now that we've worked together as we have, we truly become this network that is really quite hard almost to distinguish who's who and who works with which agency, because we really are all singing from the same song sheet. So we sort of came together as a group of people who'd all been working for varying lengths of time, but had got frustrated with that revolving door, had never actually solving the problem. You dealt with issues as they came and you delivered to, and then you discharged, and then they come back round again. So whether that be a police officer, social worker, schools, we were all finding the same problems. So we wanted to be remembering what we said, that being cited on upstream and making sure that we're preventing those problems before they really happen. We've got that public health approach of being cited on the causes of the causes. What is it that is causing the violent crime or whatever issue it is that we want to look at? Because we know that we could focus on an enforcement level, and that actually what we would do is we would move the problem to another problem, because you're not actually getting to the causes of the causes. Then this public health approach, working in a preventative manner, that joining up systems so that we're really looking at making more effective practice across all of them. But then also challenging that system to work in a slightly different way. So to be focused on strengths-based practice, really seeing what is good about somebody before we move on to putting our plans together. And our planning across multi-agencies, we're looking to make sure that it is recognises trauma and the impact of trauma at an early stage and the whole life course development of that person. So being really minded and cited on the neurological and biological impact of trauma, and then how that affects a person's whole life course, making sure that when professionals are aware of that, they're then using language which is appropriate, strategies which are appropriate, and really looking at somebody through a trauma-informed lens and saying, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. How are we where we are at? So all of our programs of work have that trauma-informed golden thread running through it, join all those systems up together. But really, one of the key things that we were saying is be focused on what is good about somebody and be willing to to really get down alongside somebody, step out from behind our lanyard and come in as a human next to another human and say, what is it that has caused you to be where you are in your families, and what can we do to help you, and what can we do to support you? So let's look at what's really great about what you're doing, and let's find ways of building on that. And then making sure that we don't do with people, so that we don't do to people. You know, all too often when I was talking about that revolving door that we were all fed up of, that, you know, maybe I would exclude somebody or refer to an agency, refer to children's social care. We'd put a 6-week parenting programme into place, tick the box, say it was done, discharge, and wait for it all to go back up again, the cycle back to that threshold of need again. We were saying that instead of doing that, what we really need to do is talk to people, find out draw those positive plans together, but be willing to be innovative and find things that work with that person that address their need, rather than us saying, oh, well, you fit into this box, we'll do this to you. So instead of doing to, we want to do with people that we're working with. And then if we can bring that change within our public services, we'll start to see all those other outcomes we were talking about. So really responding to lived experience. And that might be client-based, or it might be right at a point when you are at a more strategic level, when you're deciding how do we address problems that are arising from data, what new plans do we put in place, but make sure that before we do, we sit down and we talk to the people directly involved so that we don't go off on a tangent and get it wrong again. And then make sure that as they are telling us about their experience, we're judging it against any data and evidence that there is that says this is a good strategy that deals with that problem that we're being told is an issue. So those are the key strands, if you like, that define our Lancashire VRN strategy. So Steve, I think you were going to talk next about enforcement and prevention.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. So yes, so the Violence Reduction Network strategy does place a strong emphasis that we cannot enforce our way out of the problem of serious violence, but there is a place for it, obviously. And as in line with National Serious and Organised Crime Strategy, the 4P approach to prepare, prevent, pursue and protect, we do need to include enforcement as an arm. And I think an example from the COVID regulations recently, where we use the 4 E's of engage, explain, encourage and enforce, we look at other areas to actually explain our rationale really for taking enforcement action, but it won't be the first course of action that we will take or think about first. If I can just allude to a couple of operations, Operation Sceptre, that was a week of action, national week of action against knife crime on the 9th to the 15th of November. So from a Lancashire perspective, from our police force, there were 48 arrests, 20 of those were knife-related arrests, 127 stop searches carried out specifically by the officers deployed on that operation, 33 weapon sweeps. So again, some of this is sweeping areas, and what we find with that is it's a community engagement event as well, that people, members of the community, can speak to the officers and the staff and connect any issues they have as well there. There was 4 weapons found on those sweeps. So that's weapons that have been discarded or disposed of. They're now taken off the streets. And thankfully 10,000 knives or sharp-bladed weapons have been taken off the streets nationally in that week of action. With that as well, we also support Operation Uchi, which looks at the online purchase of knives from across the world. And again, we're looking at developing that in the future with further acts of Parliament as well. And what we found was with the officers over recent years with austerity, a lot of their proactive ability to stop search has been eroded slightly. So we've improved their stop search training, and that has also helped them with their communications, the way they actually stop people and explain their powers and why they're doing it in the first place. But anyway, I'll just hand over to Lindsay just to talk about the evidence-informed section.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Steve. So in terms of evidence, evaluation and data and research, It's one of our key priorities within our strategy, and we're working to collect data, analyse data and improve the quality of data all the time within the VRM and on a national basis as well with other VRUs. And we're working with researchers very closely in collaboration with different research institutes to evaluate our approaches and to make sure that the interventions that we're implementing are making a difference, that they are having an impact and achieving the outcomes that we're aiming to achieve, as well as generating new knowledge. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we're just briefly going to talk about an overview of our strategic needs assessment and how it's developed. So this is an overview in terms of the co-produced strategy with other agencies, with people with lived experience, with academics and with practitioners. So the first part of the needs assessment is a demographic overview of Lancashire. We then move on to look at the risk and protective factors for serious violence. We combine a crime problem profile with Public Health England fingertips database, and we also combine the existing evidence, for example, from the Early Intervention Foundation around preventing serious violence. Next slide, please. So as I previously mentioned, one of the main data sources that we drew upon was the Public Health England fingertips database. So rather than just relying on traditional crime statistics, we include hospital episode statistics, local authority data sets, and Department of Work and Pensions data. Next slide, please. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, so on this slide, basically from a perspective over the historic years, we mainly looked at crime data analysis to inform any activity, often in isolation. The MAID database, which is the multi-agency data exchange, on the left-hand side there, slide, that's just an example, utilises a few of the systems that are overlaid, and that we found really assists us and gives us that evidence-informed approach going forward. We do look at ONS data now as well, we include that, and the as I say, the MAID as well as the crime data, because again, when it's overlaid, it gives us a much clearer picture and much better. However, it's not perfect. I think certainly some of the health data can sometimes be a little bit historic, 2 or 3 years in historic data. So that's where, working together with our partners, we're looking at ways how we can improve that data exchange. Certainly the fingertips database that Lindsay alluded to there will help, but I think that's something moving forward that would really assist all agencies to address their priorities. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So the purple diagram, I'm hoping it's big enough for you to see. It's quite small on my screen, but we're happy to share a copy of the slides afterwards if anyone wants to see them in greater depth. So the purple rainbow infographic, it shows the risk factors for serious violence according to the evidence base that we're already familiar with. So what we did for our needs assessment is we took some of the risk factors, such as poverty, unemployment, poor mental health, and we looked at those variables and the data for those risk factors within Lancashire, so we could identify particular areas of need. I'll hand over to you, Siobhan, to talk about the deprivation and education data.
Thanks, Lindsay. So just focusing again, looking at that rainbow diagram, what strikes me about this all the time whenever I think about it is the interrelationship between all of these. So if you look at the individual factors around about there, for instance, around about education and employment, to take my particular interest, that aspect of low intelligence and educational achievement, truancy and exclusions, there is no doubting that is linked indelibly to all these other factors on the rest of the rest of the rainbow. So, you know, the idea of achievement in why is it so poor and stubbornly poor in specific areas? Well, all of those issues that we're looking at on the next round, on the next arch of that rainbow, can be associated with it. So, you know, parental depression, and certainly what we're seeing at the moment within COVID is just looking at our own data within our own organisation. We've seen a 10-fold increase in mental health issues in response to the increase in environmental issues and poverty and deprivation, which is growing as a result of the crisis for COVID. So you cannot look at any of these things in isolation to each other. That's why we got back to the causes of the causes all the time. And then if you go back into the wider ring of that rainbow, within my own area, transience is a big issue in terms of, and mobility within an area. And it's not necessarily the issue of mobility or transience, it's the reasons for that's important. Looking at why is the high levels of mobility, and it's quite often linked to escaping domestic abuse, escaping from drug and alcohol problems, escaping from debt-related issues, or feeling the need that this move will somehow transform my life and everything's going to be better. So all of those issues are interrelated, which is why we've rearranged them like that in the rainbow. And looking at the data that we've got around about incidents of deprivation, we can see that there are wards where deprivation are extremely high, and we can drill even into some of those wards. There will be within each district there will be specific wards which are even which have hotspots within them. So wherever you have deprivation hotspots, all of those factors that are in that rainbow are going to start to really mitigate against good consequences, whether they be health-based relationships, whether they be strong families-based relationships, or whether it be around about outcomes for educational outcomes. So until we improve all of those the deprivation statistics within an area, we're going to really struggle to hit those individual outcomes. That's why we need to see the whole thing in one, and why we need to have a network working at it. So when we look at the data that we have in the bottom left-hand corner, what that allows us to do is see where there are specific hotspots. So when we're starting to put together proposals and project plans, we can start to address them where the data is showing us there is most need in terms of poverty. So, you know, until we address that, it's really refreshing to see people now starting to talk about cultural capital. I'm not sure I really quite agree with some of the definition around about cultural capital, but what we see within our school community is children entering with lower and lower levels of school readiness. And the reason for that is that there is a lack of engagement, a lack of parental engagement due to mental health issues, due to poverty, due to alcohol abuse, due to rising domestic abuse. So what that manifests as, if you are a child living in deprivation, you are, yes, going to have all of those issues, but you're also going to have that idea of not having been, you haven't got the stability and richness of experience that other children have. So you cannot assume that these children are going to swimming lessons or going to a Cubs meeting once a week or taking part in a football team, because they simply can't afford it. They can't afford the kits, they can't afford to go on the bus to get there, they haven't got a car to get them to the places where they need to get to. So all of this lack of cultural capital starts to stack up and create huge deficiencies that when we talk about closing the gap or we talk about levelling up, we need to look at the complexity of all of those issues that are adding together to create those negative outcomes which is why we're trying to work as a joined up network focused on how do we prevent causes in the first place, rather than just trying to deal with that raw end data in terms of how, instead of saying, let's do a 6-week boost class that tries with these children to try to get them to where they need to get to, let's be sighted all the way back on how we can get that stabilise the family, how we can improve the cultural capital for all of them. So next slide.
So this slide relates to our key findings. So we've picked out a number of key findings here in the diagram on the slide, and it's helped us. So the needs assessment has very much helped us to design our interventions and to direct activity based on the findings from the needs assessment in the areas of need, as well as for the risk factors that are most prevalent in Lancashire specifically. So I'll pass it back to you, Siobhan, to talk about the causes of the causes, the risk factor findings.
So we started to talk there about those causes of the causes, and what we wanted to look at is looking at really unpicking the data sets around about all of these things. So instead of looking at attendance in isolation or exclusions in isolation, let's look at that compare alongside poverty, alongside alcohol and substance abuse services, alongside support for parents and families, because until we start to work in that way in these areas, that gap is going to just carry on widening. And certainly what we've seen during austerity, as services have withdrawn and as less and less provision has been put in place, is that school readiness levels are dropping like a stone. So we now have children who will be arriving in our schools with absolutely no vocabulary. In fact, our children who arrive from Eastern European countries are just getting off the plane and coming to school the week after have a better level of English than some of our Indigenous population. So they have problems with speech and language. They have problems with interactions with each other, very aggressive. They have problems in terms of socialization. They're either very aggressive or very withdrawn. And what we've even started to notice is a complete lack of sensory stimulation. So you can actually walk up to a child and wave your hand in front of their face and they just don't see it, because their brain development has completely been different to those of other children who've had lots of sensory stimulation, lots of positive attachments and good neurobiological background to be growing up in. So that's what we mean by the causes of the causes.
Okay, so moving on to the crime, obviously what we did within the strategic needs assessment and the strategy is assess and analyse all the data there. And what we did find is that there was a higher prevalence of punching to the head or body in homicides rather than the use of a knife. So what we're trying to install is longer term initiatives and programmes to address these issues. You know, as I touched on earlier, enforcement and stop search is what we can do now immediately, but we need to have that sea change to change behaviour in the long term. Knife crime only accounts for 1% of all serious violence in Lancashire, so it's the public perception of that. Obviously, one knife crime is too many, and one homicide is too many. But what we do need to do is obviously give a realisation to members of the public that it's not happening every day and it's not happening every street corner, but we are making inroads into putting longer term solutions into place. And obviously that's including prevention and enforcement. But Lindsay, do you want to talk about public perceptions?
Yes, I will do. Thanks, Steve. So the four sort of rectangular shapes at the bottom, they capture the sort of public perception findings that came out of a survey that we commissioned by Planning Express. So interestingly, I'll just pull out a couple of the key findings. So one of them was that 44% of young people were worried about knives, but only 2% actually disclosed having carried a knife. The survey was anonymous, but obviously not all children will have necessarily disclosed. Another finding, interestingly, was that young people, they really believed that communities were part of the problem, so the solution to knife crime, whereas adults were more inclined to think that harsher sentences and more enforcement was the solution when asked. Next slide, please. Siobhan, I'll let you start off with the interventions, the work streams.
So having taken all of that needs assessment into consideration and all of the data, we then started to draw together some specific work streams that we thought would address those issues, taking those golden strands into consideration, making sure that it was trauma-informed, making sure that it was multi-agency, making sure that it was co-produced and really responded to experts by experiencing. So we've done some work with parenting programs. We've put EPEC in place in 2 places around about the county, and we're investigating other options around about the 0 to the first 1,000 days agenda. We've also done some work around about exploitation, where we've looked at what's happening in other areas, other authorities. We found materials. We talked to children, young people who have been exposed to exploitation, and we've started to put some materials together. So we've put together a Lancashire toolkit that will be available for multi-agency practitioners, and we'll be delivering some training around that. But we're also working with a victim of exploitation who is going to then work with our group of young people to look at what it is that makes them resistant to the support that's offered to them around about exploitation. Because you can go into any school in the country and they do assemblies, or they'll put on presentations. But I always liken that to dad dancing. We're totally uncool. We have no sort of relevance as far as the children are concerned at all. Whereas somebody who has lived experience and is recognised by young people as being authentic in their own experiences and need will cut through much more than the message from statutory partners or from professionals. So we're working with that group to really look at what we can do to create a messaging that breaks that professional boundary that there is at present. And then we're also looking at some work around about trauma-informed services. We want to make sure that all of our public services in Lancashire and all of our third sector groups are really cited on what it means to have been affected by trauma. So we need them to understand the biology. We need them to understand, we need them to change their labelling. So for instance, instead of talking about a child as being aggressive and choosing to be aggressive or choosing to be confrontational, we'll start talking about a child in a stress response who is feeling hypervigilant, hyper-aware, and very quickly flips, so that they've lost the frontal cortex, part of their brain isn't listening to, they're not responding to it. So helping professionals to understand that's what they're dealing with, looking at behaviour as communication rather than as a criticism. So making sure that everybody looks through a trauma-informed lens. For instance, in schools and for school nursing services, looking at attendance rates of children, we might have looked at high incidences of regular absences, for short-term absences, and said, well, this is just a question of family dysfunction and disorganisation. This family just needs to organise themselves a bit better. Nobody can be this ill on this regular basis. So you need to sort your routines out and make sure you get the stuff to school. But it could be, if we look through a trauma-informed lens, it could be that we're saying this child actually has a lowered autoimmune system as a result of their body's response to stress. And maybe therefore they are more prone to picking up low-level illnesses on a regular basis. So by looking at the same issue through a trauma-informed lens, it changes our practice. So what we're starting to do is introduce how-to trauma-informed sessions across the police, children's social care, probation services, schools, all of the agencies that we're working with, early help services, and we're starting to roll all sorts of training out, which is trauma-informed. And we want a consistent approach so that all those organisations can use an assessment tool that helps them decide where they are in terms of being fully trauma-informed in their practice, and draw plans together and form networks within their own locality that will help each other and reinforce that development of trauma-informed practice. So another good example of that is the prisoners and prison families. And if you look, the Strength Inside and Out logo at the bottom of this page is particularly pertaining to our prisoner and prisoners' families work. So we take a group of prisoners and we work with those prisoners that are ready to engage on a therapeutic programme of support called Strength Inside. And then we work with their families and their children, and we send school teachers, hopefully, in with the children into prison, show the work that they've been doing, so that we can start to really build strong, ongoing relationships between the families, and therefore reduce reoffending rates, but also reduce generational reoffending rates, because 64% of boys whose parents are in prison will go on to offend themselves. So unless we can mitigate against that. So we've produced resources and materials to help us teach and work alongside children, young people and their families and prisoners. So there's a series of leaflets on the Violence Reduction Network website, which have been produced by working with prisoners and young people. And we've also used the text from prisoners with a little girl's story about her dad being in prison and turned it into a picture book that can be used to support. And that's currently being trained across the piece with over 100 multi-agency participants in Lancashire turning up for the training, and around about 400 schools turning up for the training. So those are some of the work streams that we've got ongoing. I think, Steve, are you going to talk through Divert and A&E Navigators and Marek?
I can just quickly touch on them. Obviously, for people on the call, on our website, the LVRN website, we've got progress reports and further details if you want to read about it further. But I'll just touch on quickly Lancashire Divert programme. It's a custody intervention programme with coaches from the football trusts across all the custody suites in Lancashire, 18 to 25-year-olds initially, and then we're looking at a youth divert programme to be developed. We're looking at getting people into education, training and employment from that setting, obviously at a time of need. The Accident and Emergency Navigator is a similar service, but into accident emergency setting. 2 nurses are currently working on a pilot there. And what we found during COVID lockdown is that the football custody intervention coaches weren't going into custody. So they assisted with the accident navigation, emergency navigators. And again, that just proved that it's a very similar service, intervening at an appropriate time and being that link to other services. And then lastly, just the multi-agency violence reduction. That's around a domestic violence pilot project. The MARAC conferences, multi-agency risk assessment conferences. We're just looking at a pilot there that's just going to be evaluated by the Northumbria University. Pam Davis was on a presentation earlier. Pam and her team are going to do an academic evaluation of that service, and we're hoping to roll it out further. Obviously, those are some of the programmes across Lancashire and some of the partners that we're working with. Lindsay, do you want to say anything else? Do you want to move on?
Yeah, just to summarise really, and going back to the whole systems approach. So our aim's always been to work collaboratively and to put individuals, children and families and adults at the centre to address their needs. So not fitting people into services that exist already, but designing the services as much as is possible by listening to the needs of those individual people. So our ethos as part of the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network has really been about adapting the system to fit individual needs by putting those individuals at the heart of our work. So next slide, please. I'm also conscious of time because we're to leave some time for discussion and questions. So I think the next couple of points are very much about future orientated slides and where we're heading. So we've already talked about identifying gaps in data, improving the quality of data in order to improve the research that we can produce. And one of the ways we are trying to improve that the way we're working is by collaborating with NHS England and Improvement. So there's plans for a contextual safeguarding dashboard development so that we can make data readily available for different areas nationally across the country in relation to serious violence as one of the themes. Next slide, please. Another way that we're trying to capture progress is by focusing on outcomes and evidencing the impact and outcomes that we're having. Is the research filtering through, and is it making a difference in practice on the ground? Are we seeing those differences in terms of outcomes for children and families? Next slide, please. I'll touch on this briefly, but we're also capturing progress through really annual progress reports. So the first one was produced in September of this year. Siobhan, do you want to touch on an example from the progress report in terms of how we've picked up on the findings from the needs assessment and documented and captured progress?
Yeah, so for instance, on the high levels of emotional and mental health in school-aged children, this was data that was glaring on the public health data set when we looked at it. So one of the things we did was to put together 2 trauma-informed response documents for schools, and we're also combining that with the toolkit around about exploitation, because we make that link between school vulnerability, exclusions, poor attainment within schools and poor school experience, and being more vulnerable to exploitation. So we've put together, for instance, there's a trauma-informed, there's a little book of ACEs which is available on the website that's free to download that people can use as a discussion document. But there's also on the resources website, we decided that due to COVID, we'd have to put a trauma-informed response for schools in relation to COVID onto that website. So it talks about how do we respond in a trauma-informed way to the challenges that COVID presents for us, and also how do we then alter our curriculum experiences within schools to allow us to meet those demands that COVID has presented. So how do we talk what do we mean by a recovery curriculum? It shouldn't be a more pressured curriculum. It should be one which really allows for healing alongside helping children to catch up any gaps in learning that have been identified. So those are two particular examples.
Thanks, Siobhan. Next slide, please. So just finally moving on to the last slide, there's a number of next steps that are planned in place. So one of them we've mentioned already around the contextual data dashboard that's being developed in collaboration with NHS England and Improvement. And we're continually monitoring. Steve had spoken previously about collaborating with a number of different research partnerships for evaluation and to capture some of the evidence base for the work that's being carried out in Lancashire, and also working with the national evaluation team that have been commissioned by the Home Office to capture some of the progress made by VRUs across the country. A real focus for the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network as next steps is plans for sustainability. We're yet to hear about confirmation of funding for the next financial year from the Home Office, and this will really influence what interventions we're able to commission next year in terms of our approach. But ultimately, we'll continue with the World Health Organization 4-step process of identifying the problem and continually adapting, continually reviewing the evidence base around the risk and protective factors, evaluating the evidence, and then scaling up initiatives where they are seen to be effective and we've got an evidence base for doing so, but also generating new knowledge from the ground up and testing out new innovative interventions in practice. Thank you very much, and we'll move on to some questions and discussions.
Okay, everybody. Just so obviously, thank you for listening to our presentation. There, we have got some questions, and I think Ben's going to facilitate responses potentially. But just an open question to people. Have you got any questions or reflections on the presentation? What are your thoughts about it, please?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just jump in quickly, Stephen, and say if you want to raise your hand, you should see that function either in Feedloop or Zoom, and then we'll call on people in order just so that we don't have 15 people at once trying to.
Can we move on to the second question then? And so the second question, I guess this is related, but is there anything that surprised you during the presentation that wasn't what you were expecting?
And of course, if you can't find the hand raise function, feel free to just unmute and jump in. There's a question in the chat asking, is there a contingency if the Home Office do not award a third year of funding, or is there any planning around that?
I can maybe give a response to that. Obviously, with the Violence Reduction Network, we have a governance board, and we've been speaking with other partners on that board, which meets every 2 months at this moment in time, looking at each of our priorities, our joint priorities really, and how we can work forward, knowing that at some point the funding won't last forever and it won't be there forever. So we're trying to look at how we can manage that, how quickly we'll have to do that. We'll have to be seen in the next few months.
Thank you.
But it's a challenge.
Another question in the chat. Alicia would be interested to hear about any evaluations you've conducted so far and what the results are.
So yeah, I can come in there if you like. Steve and Siobhan, feel free to contribute as well. But we've commissioned evaluations with a number of different research partners, such as the University of East Anglia, Northumbria University, Liverpool John Moores, the Public Health Institute there. The interim findings of the initial evaluation that we commissioned of the whole systems approach in Lancashire to be completed by Liverpool John Moores. Those interim findings are due in December, around the 18th of December actually. So I'm cautious, although we've had a provisional feedback internally, not to share those results as of yet, but they will be available in due course. And similarly with the Caring Dads evaluation of the parenting programme, that will be due about July 2021.
We have also had, we're collecting data in terms of interaction with our various resources on the website, and in terms of interaction on the various training that we've been providing. And so far, all of the feedback and attendance rates to that have been very high. So it's kind of we're at that point where we're starting to implement programmes and starting to raise awareness, and then hoping to see those other results feed in as we work our way through.
We have, I've noticed, not to put Becky on the spot, but Becky's on the call, and she's actually been carrying out some evaluation around trauma-informed approaches that have been facilitated, the training that's been facilitated by the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. Becky, would you feel comfortable giving a bit of a summary of the findings so far? Not to worry, I'm not sure if she's able to come in or not. But
I see she's commented in the chat on FeedLoop, but maybe struggling to get her audio connected.
Not to worry in that case, but as I say, the findings sort of provisional at the moment, and but please do get in contact with the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. The details are on the final slide for any contact in terms of interim findings from December onwards.
Great. Anyone else with comments or thoughts, or maybe you guys have some questions as well that you would like to put to the audience?
Yeah, one of the questions that we had in mind was if people were to take one thing away from the session, what would that learning be? I'm not sure if you can see FeedLoop. I can't actually see it, but I can't see any comments in the Zoom chat, so we can
Zoom group chat. I've got a couple of comments there. This is a really ambitious project, great work. Sorry, Ben, do you want to?
Oh, no problem. It's your show to run, but yeah, I can read through. This is a really ambitious project, great work, but it will take a while to filter through to actual violence reduction. Do you have any early wins?
So I guess with all of it, because we're cited long term and it is ambitious, we're looking for what those green shoots are. And initially those green shoots are how many people are signing up, taking part, contributing, what's the feedback we're getting for those people. And so far that's been really, really positive. But Steve, in terms of some of the stuff we've been doing around about enforcement, and in terms of some of the campaigns that we've run, there's been some good data that's come out of that, isn't there?
And certainly what we're finding here, we've run a You Can campaign, which builds on the strengths of the individual, but also looks at how people can address issues and signpost other people as well, which has worked well. And the actual reach, I think it was like 5.5 million hits on Instagram or something. It's thousands of people we're reaching, 3,000 people I think it was on one of the comments. Some of the videos are being viewed, so it's just amazing how many people actually use social media and get the message out further and wider than the audience that we're just focusing on in Lancashire.
I can also come in there in terms of sort of, I think it's it's fair comment around that it will take a long time for some of these interventions that we've been delivering to filter down to actually reduce violence on a population level in Lancashire and nationally in collaboration with other VRUs. But I think on an individual level, we're certainly seeing differences on the back of some of the interventions that have been delivered. So with the MARAC team, so the new approach to MARAC in Lancashire, there's certainly increased numbers of people going into employment, for example, from the pilot project. As I say, we're working with Northumbria University around a fuller evaluation of that programme of work. But there are some early indicators. So although the high level aspirational outcomes, for example, would be that individuals, families and communities are supported to be safe from violent and violent crime, we have got some early indicators that some of the risk factors are being reduced for individual people and families, although the population level data will take longer to change, I'm sure.
And in some of the schools work that we've been doing, when we've had trauma-informed groups of schools, we've seen some really great data coming through in terms of improvements in attendance rates and reduction in exclusion numbers. And both school attendance and exclusion statistics, of course, are vital in terms of creating vulnerability to all of the issues that we've been talking about tonight.
So, yeah. Oh, go ahead, Lindsay.
Sorry, yeah, I would say we're very passionate about capturing sort of change in practice. So with the trauma-informed training, we've learned from the evaluation that people are finding the training interesting, they're enjoying it, they're learning new things, which is great, and that's a real positive start. But we're also really interested in capturing, tracing that difference through into practice to see what impact that has in terms of outcomes for children and families or adults that we're working with. So that's more difficult to capture, but it is something that we're aiming to do, following the journey through of say training, and how does that work, how is that individual practitioner, how is that group of practitioners then working differently with children and families on the back of that, and capturing the perceptions of the children and the families themselves, so that rather than a practitioner just saying that they changed their practice, is that actually being felt and being experienced by members of the public.
So I am conscious of time, and there's a closing session at 4, but maybe we have time for just one more quick question. Mark put a good question, I think, into the chat. He asks, what do you find is the best approach for getting access and buy-in from stakeholders when much of the work is intergenerational?
We've just found that it's about working with the willing, so creating coalitions of the willing, so finding partners across agencies who are really receptive to the message, and then joining those people up and getting them work together in that way has been one of the ways that we've been most successful in getting buy-in across sectors and across generations.
I think
just to follow that up as well, I can just say, certainly when we look at the evidence base, when we look at the data we're showing people around all the obviously the council areas across Lancashire, it certainly helps with the commission as well of where the need is and where we need to put resources and activity. And I think that's the balance. But certainly what Siobhan says, working with the willing has helped, and then people have come on board. They're finding out about what our projects are, about the difference we're making, and then supporting our further development.
Because originally, Steve, when we started working on the trauma-informed practice across professionals, it felt like we were talking to a very small group, but then it's kind of hit a tipping point in the last 6 months or so. We found now that it's snowballing, and that that we're working with big groups of people. So at any one point in time, we'll be training hundreds of people, bringing hundreds of people on board from across sectors. So it's starting working with those that want to hear, but winning successes with that, and then watching that grow has been, I think, one of our key features.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, I agree.
So unfortunately, go ahead, Lindsay.
No, sorry, I was just saying to agree with what Siobhan and Steve have already said, but we've really looked for tapped into different agencies and looked for agents of change. And those agents of change have then been able to disseminate the message on a wider basis, and agents of change at multiple levels within organisations. So sort of high up strategic level, as well as on the ground. So we're working at sort of all levels of organisations and with communities and people with lived experience.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. This has been a great discussion. Unfortunately, we are hampered by time. And there's lots of good questions coming in the chat. So maybe Lindsay and Siobhan or Stephen, you can just give a quick blurb about where to find you or how to connect with you to ask more questions if people would like to do that.
Certainly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, there's maybe ways if you wanted to put contact information into the chat, or I'm not sure if your information is available as presenters through the N8 conference, but if anybody has any of those questions, you can reach out to me and I will, through the back channels, make sure that you get connected, just in case I don't want to see any of these good questions go unanswered. So with that, I will thank our presenters, Stephen, Siobhan, Lindsay. Thanks so much for your presentation. It was very engaging, and clearly we could spend all afternoon speaking about these topics. At this moment, I'll encourage everyone to head back onto FeedLoop. There is a closing session for today. You're encouraged to go to that, where we'll do some reflection on all of the topics that we talked about today. So thank you all very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.